So I just want to take a couple seconds to introduce our distinguished speakers here. And then I'll give you a couple of notes on how the session's going to go. We've got plenty of time for Q&A, and I suspect all of you will want to ask some questions. To my immediate left is Tim DeRoche. His bio says he's a Renaissance man. I want my bio to say I'm a Renaissance man. He is the author of A Fine Line, which actually there are free copies of outside for you to get if you'd like to. It is a wonderful and accessible yarn on the problem we're here to discuss today about school attendance zones and boundaries. So thank you, Tim. To Tim's right is Kelley Williams-Bolar, who many of you may know. I don't want to sort of like ruin the punchline. In a lot of respects, she is a wonderful example of the problem we are here to discuss, and hopefully. Love you, Kelley! Got the Ohio Mafia here. Great. To her left is Representative Valencia Stovall, who should need no introduction. Is a former state rep in Georgia who has worked on a specific piece of legislation that we'd like to talk about today with reference to this specific problem, but who also has been a champion of all things school choice in the Georgia legislature, including the constitutional amendment to make charter schools legal.
That was a little bit before my time.
It was a couple years, okay, all right, fine. I just give it all to you.
So. I appreciate it.
And to the left is somebody who, to your left is somebody who should need no introduction at this point, the smartest person in the room, Patricia Levesque. So let's start with Tim. Well, hold on, I'm gonna tell you how this is gonna go. The first thing we're gonna do is actually describe for you the problem. I'm getting my high school teacher. I was never a high school teacher, but I think this is the way you're supposed to do it. So you're gonna learn about the problem, and then we're gonna see the effects of this problem on real people. We're gonna talk about how elected leaders, of which there are myriad in this room, try to solve this problem, and then we're gonna talk about what policy tools are available for you to try to solve it, should you try to. And then we're gonna discuss the whole thing with an extensive Q&A where we try to convince you that you should go die on this hill. So Tim, please get started.
All right, thanks, Derrell. First, just want to say how grateful I am. I've been geeking out on this issue for the past 4 or 5 years, and so just so grateful to Governor Bush and Patricia and Excel and Ed for giving me the opportunity to geek out in public. Derrell and I have been, in particular, geeking out on Zoom about this issue. Also honored to be on the stage with Kelley and Representative Stovall. They've shown tremendous courage on this issue. You know, I've written a book. These guys have really shown personal courage on this issue. And finally, I want to say, just honored to follow the discussion we had at lunch and to be on the stage following Professors George and West. That, more of those kinds of conversations, please. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And something that Professor George said really resonated with me. He was talking about how just laws bind us together, right? And so we need to show a particular attentiveness to the laws. Are they just? Are they binding us together, or are they unjust? And so I want to spend a little bit of time today kind of calling our collective attention to some laws that I think, laws and policies, that I think are unjust and that are failing in that binding function. So let's start, maybe we'll pull up some slides. Quick glory shot of the book. We'll move on from that quickly. So I want to start with my old neighborhood in Los Angeles. And so this is a neighborhood that I lived in until about 3 or 4 months ago, and I'll be fully honest, I love our new neighborhood, but I still think of this neighborhood as our home. This is northeast Los Angeles, about 2 miles, a little bit northeast of downtown Los Angeles. Extremely diverse, blue-collar neighborhood, lots of changes in recent years, influx of young folks from the entertainment industry, tremendous positive energy in this part of town. And I want to talk in particular about the schools. So this is a map. This is a part of Los Angeles Unified School District. And I'm talking about Los Angeles here mainly because I know it so well. I think any of you from urban centers around the country are going to recognize some of these issues and how they play out. So what you've got here is an excerpt from one of the district's formal maps of schools. You can see the school in the center is Mount Washington Elementary. That is a very sought-after, coveted school up on the hill in this area of northeast Los Angeles. And then what you have around it are 7 other elementary schools. And those include Glassell Park, Toland Way, Buchanan, Aldama. These are the neighborhoods, for any of you familiar with Los Angeles: Mount Washington, Glassell Park, Cypress Park, Highland Park. So I just want to talk about enrollment before we get to the other stuff. So we've heard other speakers talk about the enrollment declines in the last couple years. I want to talk about the enrollment declines that have been happening in many urban centers long before the pandemic. So these charts are all pre-pandemic data. But this is the total enrollment at these 8 LA Unified elementary schools in Northeast LA. And you can see that there's been a very, very dramatic decline in enrollment in those schools. All sorts of things going on here: changes in demographics, changes in birth rates, charter schools, lots of things going on. This is actually more dramatic than the enrollment drop for Los Angeles Unified as a whole, which is about 40% over the same time period. But take a look at this. So this is all of the schools indexed, their enrollment indexed to 1995, the 1995-96 school year. So what you can see is that all of the elementary schools in the neighborhood have followed one pattern, except one, and that is Mount Washington Elementary. This is this very coveted elite school. My wife sometimes lets me peer over her shoulder at the moms groups online, and there is all sorts of talk about how you get your kids into Mount Washington Elementary. How do you do it? You make sure they live within this red dotted line, right? So I know a lot of you are very familiar with district boundaries, and Kelley and Representative Stovall are going to talk very powerfully about district boundaries. I want to talk about an analogous type of boundary that is all over urban public education, which is the attendance zone. So that misshapen thing is the attendance zone for Mount Washington. If you live within that dotted line, you are guaranteed a spot. If you live outside, you are exceedingly unlikely to get in. So we've all seen these before, but just want to emphasize the dramatic differences in performance between schools that are within blocks. All of these schools are within a mile of Mount Washington Elementary. You can see Mount Washington had 75% reading proficiency. You've got very nearby schools like Aragon Avenue, which is just 16% reading proficiency. Again, these are pre-pandemic 2019. So this is demographics. You can talk about this on a racial basis. You can also talk about it on an income basis. So Mount Washington, almost 60% white. The highest percentage of white students at any of the surrounding schools is 9%. So really, this is an island, a school serving an island of high-income parents. And I should emphasize, these are not the wealthiest of the wealthy, right? These are upper middle income parents who've bought into this zone. And the other thing I want to emphasize is if you look, all of those surrounding schools have attendance zones, right? They all have attendance zones, but those zones don't matter. My daughter was actually zoned to go to the blue school on the left, and we wanted her to go to the yellow school because it was close to the daycare that we use in the neighborhood. No problem to get her into the other school because all of those schools have a tremendous amount of excess capacity. The school that does not have excess capacity is Mount Washington Elementary, and so they are the only ones using the zone to keep folks out. I used to point to that little misshapen thing at the top there. and say what kind of shenanigans went into that. We don't know. It's important to note that these lines are drawn. These are, district boundaries are usually subject to the political process. That happens out in the open. These attendance zone boundaries are drawn in the bowels of these school district buildings. What I was told by somebody in the neighborhood, I posted this on Twitter, and somebody said, I've been told by the old timers in the neighborhood that Mount Washington was running out of students a few years ago. So they went in search of the other white neighborhood, right, within the bigger area. So redlining, right? We already have a name for discriminating against folks based on where they live in deciding whether they are eligible for or not eligible for valuable government services. We call that redlining. This is a redlining map from the early part of the 20th century, drawn by a federal government agency determining who is eligible for federal housing assistance and mortgages, and the red and yellow areas, declining areas, hazardous areas, predominantly neighborhoods with people of color and immigrants. So one of the most astounding days, I'd been writing about the analogies between redlining and modern day attendance zones. I'd been writing about that, and I thought, wait a second, these are maps. I can line them up. And so my first attempt to do that was in Los Angeles. So here you can see the Mount Washington attendance zone lined up against the redlining map of the same area. This is a map that's 80 or 90 years old. And you can see that the attendance zone largely covers the area that was deemed best or desirable back in the early part of the 20th century, and it still excludes the areas of town that have significant proportions of people of color and immigrants. So it's the same thing happening 80 to 90 years later. So the Urban Institute recently, about a month ago, came out with this great report really taking a systematic approach to some of the ideas that I highlight in the book. So this is a map from the Urban Institute and shows Mary Lynn Elementary School in Atlanta. You can see the dots are families by race, and you can see that the Mary Lynn, it's the little sliver, kind of the crescent-shaped sliver, there largely captures the upper income white part of town while excluding folks who live within walking distance of the school who are of other races. This is an important one because the enrollment thing played out here too. Mary Lynn was running out of space, and the Atlanta Public Schools invested $15 million to renovate Mary Lynn, despite the fact that there were many schools within walking distance of the neighborhoods in question that had hundreds of open seats, right? So the taxpayers were on the hook for this. We found this in Lakewood Elementary in Dallas, Lincoln Elementary in Chicago, and Mary Lynn here, where the district spent $10 to $20 million on a renovation of a school, primarily because these very politically powerful parents paid a premium to live in those neighborhoods, and they weren't in a position to say, hey, we need to redraw the lines because the demographics have changed. And so I actually have a tremendous amount of sympathy for anyone who's bought into one of these zones, trying to make the system work for them. But you shouldn't have to buy your way into a free public school. And just a couple more. Here's a Brooklyn map, PS8 and PS307. Same patterns here. Many of the kids who live where PS8 is their closest school are zoned to go to the struggling school that's further away. Another redlining map. Here's one from Ohio. This is Clinton and Como Elementary in Columbus. So we found these examples of these pairs of schools across the country in pretty much every major city. Okay, you can take the slides down.
So Tim, I don't want to ruin the book. Again, I urge everybody to read it, but can you talk a little bit about the infamous chapter 6 please, and the couple of examples of distorted behavior that can be found there.
Oh, right. So one of the funner parts of the book was kind of looking into how do districts enforce these lines. And so you've got examples of districts forming tip lines. You know, did you have a play date with one of your kids' classmates that was out of your area? Well, you can call this tip line, very East German Stasi-style tactics. Some of them have hired private investigators. I found an article online by a private investigator saying, hey, if you want these contracts, here's some best practices. You know, these are very lucrative contracts with the school districts. Make sure you hire a woman photographer, right? Make sure you get a telephoto lens. Do it during the summer, because in the winter, it's hard to get clear photos of kids' faces, right, when they've got scarves on. And they're saying, you know, people, make sure you hire a woman photographer, because fewer eyebrows are gonna raise if a woman is out there taking photos of the kids in the morning than a man. Just crazy stuff. I talked to an internal at a kind of a medium-sized district in California, a woman who works as a home check person. So she has to go out and check whether people live where they say they live. And she described to me going out to some neighborhoods to make sure that a homeless family, right, that was enrolled at a school, seeing if their car was parked on the right side of the line or the wrong side of the line. Could they get that kid out of the school via, hey, your car's parked in the wrong place? So a lot of shenanigans, a lot of kind of ugly behaviors, and we sort of back ourselves into a corner if we design the policies like this and we set up the laws like this. And this is a good place to talk to Kelley. Everyone lies about their address, right? Everyone lies about their address. This is very common up and down of people of all races, of all income levels. It is a very common American thing to do, to lie about your address to get into a different public school.
Tim, that was a good segue. Some might think you'd be a good moderator for this. I do. So for those who know me, like one of the earliest conversations I can ever recall is my mother and my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table trying to figure out whose address we were going to use so I could go to the middle school in Mount Royal, the Mount Royal section of Baltimore, instead of the one I was zoned to in the Sandtown, Winchester section of Baltimore. And I think that's just important because we looked at all these maps and you saw all those dots and you saw all those lines, and they all have a genuine effect on real people. And we have a real person that has experienced that here. Yeah. Kelley, would you share your story with the group, please?
Absolutely. First, I just want to say thank you so much, Jeff Bush, Patricia, for having me. It's an honor. It's my second time. Yeah, so, you know, I was going through a rough time in my life. I'm not going to make it long. I just gotten a divorce. We had 2 daughters, and I was in college, and I was a substitute paraprofessional. So I was going around different schools, subbing. And my father kept telling me, look, just bring them out here. Just bring them out here. His school was one of the top schools in Ohio. Nice suburban school. I'm talking top-notch everything. Took me a couple years, and finally I was like, okay, I'll do it. Enrolled him. First year, everything went fine, but we did have a lady that would periodically just come. And she wanted to look at the bathroom. She wanted to look at our toothbrushes. She wanted to see how many toothbrushes we had in the bathroom. She wanted to look at the bedroom, see if they were being occupied. She wanted to look in our closet. So when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, that happened that first year. Our second year, I remember a couple of months into the school year, they had an investigator follow me around for several weeks. And you know, they found out I didn't actually live day and night at my parents' house. So we tried to get something called a grandparent power of attorney, which we did. We got it. The judge gave it to us. It was no problem. But they didn't want it at that time. I guess it was what they said, too little, too late. So that June, the judge said, just remove them. And I did. I removed them. They stayed. They went back to their school zones. 18 months later, so they weren't at that school. This is 18 months later, I received an indictment, and my father received an indictment. We didn't know, well, I know I definitely didn't know, because I never had an indictment before, never been in trouble at all. And so we go to court, look at the process. It's Ohio versus Kelley Williams-Bolar, it's Copley Fairlawn City Schools. And I'm like, what? I'm like, well, that was 18 months ago. Like this. So I was like, okay, and, I gotta get serious. This is a serious matter. It was an indictment, it was charges, it was grand theft and tampering with documents. And so I'm like, and there was another charge too. I can't remember what that one was, but they dropped it from the pressure of the people. They dropped that charge. But I remember just, looking at my family and my daughter, and I served, it was 10 days. I served 9 of the 10. I was on probation for 3 years. If I had messed up at all, I would have had my 5 + 5 consecutive. That means I would have went away for 10 years. It was so traumatic. My dad was charged the same thing, but they could not, they had to drop his charges because he didn't enroll the girls, I enrolled them. So they just, once you get in the lion's mouth, they're just not gonna let you go. So my dad,
It's okay.
so my dad, they started finding other things, and it was just like, they put him in the penitentiary because they said, oh, you were getting SSI and you should have gotten disability. He was 60-some years old. He didn't know he was sick. So, of course, he dies. He don't come home. He had never been in a penitentiary before. So, it's just like this. It's at the end of the day, look, I'm just a mom, a regular family, just wanting the best for my children, like everyone else. I want them to have an opportunity like everyone else, like we all should. That's why I fight. That's why I continue, and I'm not going to stop. And I'm just so happy that now I see policy. I see a different wave now. This is different than even 4 or 5 years ago. There are policymakers, there are people out here that really want, and they see that we're human. It's not about just political gain. It's about the realness of our future. So I didn't mean to get upset. Thank you, so sorry.
Just so everyone knows, they're actually making a movie about Kelley's life. It's called Robbed, A Mother's Peril, the Kelley Williams-Bolar story, to be released at some point in the near future. So, you talked about policy. Again, like great setup. Representative Stovall. I just want to lead off with this. Like, this is a room full of smart people. There are lots of legislatures across the country filled with smart people. It's not like people don't know this is a problem. Can you talk a little bit about why more is not done? I mean, and very specifically about what you have tried to do. But again, in a room full of smart people who see this problem and know it has the kinds of effects on real people that we've heard Tim and Kelley discuss, like, why is more not done?
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Governor Bush and Patricia, for inviting, and of course, Tim with his book, because it uncovers a lot. Like you said, we know that these issues are prevalent. As a legislator, I knew it. All of my colleagues knew it. But when it came down to actually making the changes, that's where the buck stopped, right there, and it didn't move. So I attended one of the conferences, just like you all are here now. Kelley happened to be one of the guests on that panel. And when I heard her story, I thought about my story, about my family story, about using other addresses. Did not know that I could possibly have went to jail, or my parents could have went to jail, or whoever else could have gone to jail. And I said, well, I better go back and check Georgia to see if this is possible, that someone could be prosecuted, after hearing her story. So I went back, did some research, and found out that Georgia did not have a law that would prevent someone from doing the same thing that would happen to Kelley. And so I began the process, legislative process, and introduced House Bill 788. And it went through a process, and so when you're looking at the situation that happened with her and looking at personally, a lot of times as legislators, when introducing bills, we look at it from a personal lens or someone we've known that has gone through that particular situation. So introducing the bill, of course, there was a lot of pushback. One was, okay, if we allow open enrollment for any student to attend the better, perceived better schools, then what is that going to do for our budget? That's going to take the enrollment away from the kids, from the school district where those kids are coming from. How the children are going to get there to those schools, the transportation was another issue. And then, of course, the big one for the kids, for the better choice schools, was the attendance. Okay, that's going to cause overcrowding, almost like what Tim mentioned with the elementary school in Atlanta, where they extended out, but only for that attendance zone. And so I said, it's got to be something better. We have parents, that the ones that I represent in my district, that don't have a choice. They don't have the income level to move to the better communities. If they did, that's where they would be staying. And then there's inequity in education. And when I did my presentation to my colleagues, I brought in 3 size cups. So you think of cup, small cup, medium cup, large cup. And that's how I gave the example of the inequity that's taking place in Georgia. And so if you happen to live in the smaller cup area, which is the area where I represent it, there's no way you're going to ever get to the tall cup, no matter how much water or liquids that's pouring into it. And I want to give them a reality of this is something that's not going to change, and only we as a legislative body will be able to make those particular changes. And until we really step up and be able to say, we're going to put the money to where the resources need to be, this was an alternative. It wasn't the end all. And then one other thing that was asked of me when I presented the bill was, well, won't you just make it where we can just decriminalize someone who uses the address? And I was like, well, why do we have to we could decriminalize it, but the whole point is why are they having to do all of that? So my particular bill, it said allowed for anyone who knew someone that lived in a district that was more considered to have a better choice of school, they can use that address. They didn't have to be a relative. I went back and forth with my colleagues. So, well, what about if they'll be their relative? I said, I don't have a relative that stays in a more affluent area, so that would knock my kids out all the time. I said, no. I said, it could be someone they know that agrees. And so the bill did not allow for any prosecution of the parent that was going to use the address, nor the person who was going to allow the parent to use their address. And I just think that when you're thinking about this issue, it's not going away. And then now with the pandemic, that's going to be exacerbated even more because you have evictions that have taken place across the United States. That means eviction is on these parents, their credit. So if they try to go and rent an area or they try to purchase a house, they're now moved back even further. And so only thing I'd like to say with the legislators that are here that you have the power to do it is look at the reality. Either you're going to change it and make it equal across the board, or if you need a process, you still have to let those parents be able to choose that school that they want their child to go to. At the end of the day, the children are going to turn 18. They're going to age out of the school system. And when they age out, they become all of our problems and situations. And when you have a community that I represented, crime is a big issue, and it's because the education foundation wasn't there. So we all pay for it through our criminal system when we're putting money into our state budget to try to combat a problem that we can solve in the beginning.
Absolutely. I think you all heard this. We're going to call this the 3 cups strategy now. And I'm glad that you mentioned it. There's a great piece in the New York Times this weekend. It's like a million words long about the overheated housing market in America right now. And they take Austin as the city that they observe. You got to read like 3,000 words into it before there's one sentence that says, oh, school zones. And then they keep going. It's almost like a throwaway. So certainly, part of the problem of housing scarcity and overheated housing markets right now is a problem of school zones. So I just want to throw that out there too. Patricia.
Yes.
So I'm a legislator in this room, and I've been convinced by all this heady talk. What do I do? What policy levers are available to me?
Well, Derrell, I'm so glad you asked. and I truly hope that every single state represented here goes home and does something about this, because this is a problem that you can solve. The basics, right? What can every single state do? You can have transparency. So every single state can pass a law that says that school zones are made public, that they're posted publicly so that everyone can see exactly what the school zones are. And then I would say the second part of that is allow any single parent whose child lives closer to a higher performing school to have a seat in that school. Because if that policy passed, you would definitely see action at the local level to rethink school zones. And so I've talked to a couple of members about this, and when you get to that point of the policy of, well, do they only have a seat if there's space available? And I say, no, you have to make space. Well, then that becomes this problem for policymakers. But I would say Governor Bush passed something in his first year in office called the Opportunity Scholarship Program. And most people remember it as being, if you were in a failing school, you got a voucher to go to private school. But another part of that policy was, if you were zoned for a failing school, you got public school choice. Any higher performing public school in the district, they had to make space for you. And that law has been in place for 20 years, and it is working. And parents who send their child to whose child is zoned for a failing school get public school choice. That can happen all across the country. But I have more ideas for you. So,
fancy that.
in addition, it's easy. Transparency should be easy. Allowing parents to have a choice if they live closer to the district should be a no-nonsense thing. But there are other funding policies that you have to take care of. Tennessee lawmakers have an opportunity this next year. Governor Lee wants to improve and innovate the school finance system in the state of Tennessee. But when they do that and they move to a student-centered model, it makes all of this work easier, right? Because then the money follows the child. Make sure when you have your state finance formula that there is weighted funding for low-income students and students with special needs, so that then when they are making choices, more money is following them. Those are basics that every state should consider. I'm excited about Tennessee's, the opportunity to impact school finance next year. Derrell, to pick up on your state, I would say maybe states like New Jersey should stop charging parents who want to go.
I was against that.
To do public school choice where they have to pay. And then one final shout out I want to say to Arizona. Arizona passed some legislation. They put $40 million into transportation grants. And so if you think about school choice, one of the biggest obstacles that parents have to face is, how do I get my child there? And so Arizona is taking a really creative approach at coming up with different solutions, like what if rideshare could be part of the solution? I'm looking forward to seeing some of the solutions they come up with.
So I will, in a rare instance of sort of like state chivalry, I will stick up for New Jersey on this one. Because New Jersey does have a program called Aid in Lieu, where it funds parents to drive their kids to schools that they can attend if the district does not bus, which is one of the underlying concepts of the Transportation Innovation Bill in Arizona. I do also want to say, I don't want to gloss over this before, because like Patricia gave you like the nice stuff, and like Tim and I kind of think you could go a little bit harder. But I don't want to gloss over the fact that like right now is like really the perfect time, the best time ever to talk about modernizing the school funding formula in a way that makes it more portable and more transparent to enable basically everything you've heard about all morning long in any of the sessions that you're in. The system is awash in money in ways that it's never been before. In the burg of Jersey City where I live, it's like $5,000 a kid extra on top of $25,000. So it's like it's an unbelievable amount of money. So there is the opportunity to do that. One of the things that used to surprise me the most, is like about the pandemic, is that why is it that we enrolled millions of kids in crappy programs of virtual instruction hosted at schools they could not go to, when they could have enrolled with the best teacher of any subject matter anywhere in the country? Like just an easy thought exercise about how strong these boundaries are when we think about like where you go to school and what your relationship with school is. So I would urge everybody to think about that too. And then just like one last piece on this. This is super important. So if you take like a year and a half worth of schooling away from a kid, it's a mistake to think that you can fill that all back up within the same amount of time day to day that everybody goes to school, which is also to say there's a huge opportunity to leverage like every other community resource, right? You've heard about Learn Everywhere and libraries and community pods and all these things that came into existence during the pandemic. And if there's anything that represents a sort of boundaryless approach to education, it is those things. So I just urge you to consider that too. So Tim, you think Patricia's like not bringing it enough?
I wouldn't say it that way. I am a bit.
How would you say it?
I am a bit of a radical on this issue. I think we should all be working, ideally, 10 to 20 years down the line, where there are no lines, where there is no geographic discrimination in determining who gets into or does not get into a public school. And that's because I see this through the lens of the social contract. I think it's very damaging to our society when people live within walking distance of public schools, that they are taxpayers in that district. They are contributing to the tax base for that district. They are contributing to the renovations of that school, and they are instead assigned to a school down the road which has been failing or struggling for decades. So I do believe that we should all be radicals in that sense of working for this long-term goal of getting rid of geographic discrimination for public schools. Now, that said, I realize the political difficulties, right, of that approach, and there are politically powerful parents who have a lot invested in these homes that they've purchased. And so there are lots of opportunities to move towards that world in ways that are palatable and that allow time for people to adjust. I like a lot of the ideas that Patricia was talking about. A great example is the transparency. You can't find a lot of these maps online. The districts don't want you to find them. They don't want parents to know that they live within a block of the line that would allow their kids to go to this elite school that's in their neighborhood. They don't want that. Publishing the maps, requiring schools to keep track of all the inquiries they get, right? All the inquiries they get and why they turned away each kid, right, that they turned away. I think there are other ideas out there. What if a school like Mount Washington had to reserve 10% of its seats for kids that don't live within that zone? What if a kid had to have an equal opportunity to enroll in any school within 3 miles of their home, 5 miles of their home? There are lots of ways in which we can incrementally move towards a world in which these lines matter a lot less. And I think anything we can do to do that is going to work out well for us in the long run.
Kelley, you are the parent voice on this one. I've found it fascinating how many people now are very concerned about what parents think about public policy. How does all this fall on you? Like if you have a former lawmaker here and like tons of lawmakers in the audience. Like what recommendation would you make to them that you think would help parents solve this problem of attendance zones?
Well, absolutely. I believe that we should start looking at the zones and we should start getting involved, which, I personally think that we are starting to shift and we are getting more involved. But today is a new day to begin your journey when you go all back home and you look and you discover what your zones are and how can you start to break down these lines, or at least start to make them disappear.
Reverend Stovall?
One other thing I did fail to mention, when you think about magnet schools and IB schools, that's not in the mix, because with magnet schools, of course, the students have to test to get in and test to stay in. Same thing with IB. So when you're looking at that equity issue, it should be, it doesn't matter what academic level those students are on. If their parents say, hey, this is where I want, for my child to be able to attend, that's where it should be going. And also don't look at, even on the financial part, monetary part of it, you have parents who don't have kids that are being educated in that school. Like my dad is a senior citizen. He doesn't have any grandkids in the school system, but he pays his property taxes every year. And you have kids whose parents whose kids attend a private school. They're not receiving any education at that particular school as well. So looking at all those aspects, and at the end of the day, don't have any excuse for not doing it. It should be no excuse. If we're looking at, we want to be able to compete globally as the United States, we only can do that because of the foundation of education that's going to be allowed for all children, no matter where they live, no matter who their parents are. It should be for all children.
One thing, Representative Stovall, that I thought you said that was really important is sort of, we buried the lead a little bit. It's not like we don't know how to make schools that work without attendance as the mechanism for enrollment, right? We have magnet schools, right? We have some that are themed and some that are tested. We have charter schools, right? Those use lotteries, right? We have private schools, like those use to tuition. So I think it's always important to remember that we're not asking people to invent a device to make good schools that doesn't already exist.
Well, I want to jump in real quick here. One of the things that I was surprised to discover is that we have this interesting asymmetry in that charter schools in most states are forbidden from discriminating against a kid based on where they live, especially if they are a constituent of the district. And then many state laws, on the other hand, empower or even require school districts to draw the zones and discriminate against folks on where they live in the district. Very strange phenomenon when you really stare hard at it. Some of the schools are required to do this, and some of them are forbidden to do it because we think it's no good. So just something to think about.
I think you're onto something there, Tim. Patricia?
Well, Tim has an incredible point. If you just had no attendance zones, think about the shock of that. Think about every single parent who realizes my child might not be able to go to the school where I bought into that zone. And they might have to go to the school that I would never want to send them to, right? And that would certainly shock the system. I just want it to be sustainable. I don't think these policymakers could handle the backlash that would come from that. But I do think there's a compromise, right? If we want to truly tear down these zones, then you could say that every new school built, right? Every brand new school that's built does not have an assigned zone. Every brand new school built is one that you have to, try to get into. And that it's a lottery like charter schools. We've talked about, I gave some ideas that are just the specifics of school zones, right? Make them transparent, make sure parents that live closer get a seat in the higher performing school. But we need to have universal public school choice also. We need to have universal private school choice. Like, parents need to be given the power to find the school that best meets their children's needs. There's so many things that can be done, but these are the basics. Like, let's start with the basics. Let's get some transparency.
I do think it's critical to create our way out of this problem, because every time we make it a zero-sum one, the people we try to help lose. The crisis of American public education right now has reached a scale that we never thought possible. It has affected people that never thought it would, in places where people moved and they thought they'd escaped it. The challenge is real, and this is one persistent part of it, and if we're ever going to change it, now is the best time. So thank you.
Great.